I never expected a quiet night at my neighbor's apartment to change everything, and her words still echo, "Stay tonight. I'll cook you breakfast too." The rain started as a whisper, tapping lightly against the windshield, and quickly became a drumming rhythm that mirrored the sudden chaos of my evening. I hadn't planned on walking up my neighbor's steps in soaked shoes, my jacket clinging to me like an extra layer of anxiety. The apartment building smelled faintly of wet concrete and old wood, a comforting familiarity that made the world outside feel distant. I hesitated at her door, aware of the absurdity of ringing her bell after dark, but something in the thought of being alone in my small apartment on a stormy night propelled me forward. She opened the door before I could knock properly, her hair slightly damp from the rain, a soft curl clinging to her cheek. The warm light spilling from her apartment framed her in a way that made the room seem smaller, cozier, almost intimate. She looked at me with an expression that mixed surprise and calm assurance. Her eyes, clear and observing, held no judgment, just a quiet curiosity that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. "Come in," she said, her voice low, warm, and steady. There was a hint of concern, but it wasn't overbearing, it was gentle, careful. As I stepped inside, the subtle aroma of something cooking, her perfume mingled with faint traces of herbs, wrapped around me like a welcome I hadn't expected. I shrugged off my wet jacket, and she handed me a towel. Our fingers brushed for a brief moment, electric but fleeting, and I could feel a strange pulse of awareness, as if that small contact had already changed something in the air between us. The apartment was dimly lit, a soft golden glow that softened the edges of the furniture and made the rain outside seem like a distant murmur. I noticed little details, the way her bookshelf leaned slightly to one side, the framed photographs of landscapes, the way her slippers peeked out from under the sofa. It all felt deliberate, thoughtful, lived in. She moved around the room with quiet grace, carrying herself with an ease that I couldn't help but admire. Even her sigh, as she handed me a mug of steaming tea, was unguarded and human, full of traces of her day. We settled into the small living room, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic tapping of rain against the windows. The quiet was comfortable rather than awkward, a rare sensation in my life. I realized, with a flicker of surprise, that I was drawn not just to her beauty or her warmth, but to the steadiness she exuded, the kind of calm that invited trust. And when she offered, softly, "Stay tonight, you don't need to go back out into this," I felt the tension in my shoulders loosen, the world outside momentarily slipping away. It was just a neighborly gesture, yet something about it felt like the start of something neither of us fully understood. And in that moment, standing in the soft glow of her apartment, I realized that an ordinary evening had quietly become extraordinary. The apartment smelled faintly of something savory simmering on the stove, the kind of scent that made you forget the chill and dampness outside. Steam curled lazily from a small pot, carrying hints of garlic and herbs that mingled with the faint sweetness of vanilla from a candle flickering nearby. I perched on the edge of the sofa, still dripping from the rain, and she moved around the kitchen with effortless grace, her movements fluid but unhurried. "You don't need to go back out tonight," she said, almost casually, but there was an underlying warmth in her voice that made me pause. Her eyes met mine, steady and soft, and for a moment I felt exposed, not in a vulnerable, uncomfortable way, but in the way you do when someone truly sees you and doesn't look away. I hesitated, aware of the boundary, the age difference, the social script that screamed at me to decline politely. Yet the apartment, the rain, the gentle light, everything conspired to make saying no feel impossible. She handed me a blanket without breaking her stride, draping it over my shoulders. The fabric was soft, flecked with the faint scent of her laundry detergent, and it rested on my skin like an unexpected comfort. Her fingers lingered a moment as she adjusted it, brushing lightly against my arm. My chest thumped with the sudden awareness of her nearness, of how ordinary gestures, folding a blanket, pouring tea, smoothing a damp curl from my forehead, could feel so intimate. "I can put out the guest room, or, you can just stay here," she said, her words gentle, unassuming, yet layered with an unspoken invitation. Her gaze held mine for a beat longer than necessary, and I realized she was giving me a choice without pressuring me. It was the kind of subtlety I hadn't learned to navigate, yet I found myself wanting to say yes, not just for convenience, but for the quiet warmth her presence promised. I nodded, and she smiled softly, a small curve of her lips that made the room feel lighter somehow. There was no rush, no awkwardness, just a quiet agreement. She motioned me toward the sofa, offering a cup of steaming tea as she continued preparing the small meal. My fingers closed around the mug, feeling its warmth seep into my hands, and I noticed the faint brush of her shoulder as she passed by. The contact was fleeting, almost accidental, yet it left a subtle imprint on my skin, a reminder of how present and attentive she was. Sitting there, wrapped in the blanket, listening to the rain and smelling the mingled scents of home and cooking, I realized that the night had quietly shifted. What began as a minor inconvenience, a storm, a soaked jacket, had become an unexpected moment of closeness, a gentle crossing of boundaries guided entirely by warmth, care, and mutual trust. And in that quiet domestic space, I felt the first stirrings of something unspoken, something fragile yet electric, waiting to grow. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle by the time we settled into the living room, the soft golden glow from her lamps casting warm pools of light across the furniture. Outside, the city was blurred by raindrops on the windows, muffling the distant hum of traffic. Inside, the apartment felt suspended, like a private world apart from the damp chill and hurried pace beyond the walls. She moved with quiet precision, pouring tea into 2 mugs. The aroma of chamomile, tinged with a hint of honey, filled the air, mingling with the lingering scent of rain on my jacket. When she handed me the cup, our fingers brushed just slightly, a touch so brief it could have been accidental, yet it left a subtle warmth that lingered far longer than the contact itself. I felt the small, steady pulse of her presence beside me, grounding yet slightly electrifying. We sat side by side on the sofa, close enough that our knees occasionally bumped together. I noticed the little details I hadn't before, the soft curl of her hair resting against her neck, the delicate curve of her wrist as she lifted her mug, the way her eyes caught the light when she smiled at something I said. There was an ease in her manner, a grace that didn't demand attention but drew it nonetheless. I felt both comforted and self-conscious under her quiet gaze, as if every small movement I made was noted, not with judgment, but with quiet interest. Conversation drifted easily, light and unforced. She spoke about her work, about a book she was reading, and even the simplest anecdotes seemed imbued with warmth. I found myself listening more than speaking, absorbing the cadence of her voice, the subtle inflections that hinted at her life experiences. There was something magnetic about the way she shared herself without oversharing, leaving spaces for me to feel present and seen. At one point, her knee brushed mine as she shifted slightly, and I became acutely aware of the small pulse of electricity that ran through me. Our proximity was ordinary yet intimate, a shared silence, a shared space, a shared moment that felt carefully suspended between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Even the slight warmth radiating from her side seemed to seep into me, a reminder that closeness didn't always need words to matter. By the time the tea had cooled and the rain outside had slowed to a whisper, I realized that the night had shifted subtly but irreversibly. The quiet moments, the soft touches, the comfortable silences, they were building something unspoken between us. An understanding, an awareness, a tender tension that neither of us had fully named yet. And in that small, softly lit room, I felt the first deep stirrings of connection, not just attraction, but something more delicate, layered, and human. The apartment felt warmer now, almost cocoon-like, the golden light soft against the corners of the room. Steam still curled from our tea mugs, carrying the delicate aroma of chamomile, and outside, the drizzle had softened to a gentle mist that traced rivulets down the windowpane. There was a quiet rhythm to the evening, soft, unhurried, and it seemed to invite honesty. She shifted slightly on the sofa, her gaze distant for a moment, as if gathering courage. "Divorce, it's strange," she said softly, almost to herself. Her voice carried no bitterness, only a quiet melancholy layered with the strength of someone who had endured and survived. I watched her carefully, noticing the way her fingers traced the rim of her mug, knuckles pale against the warm ceramic. There was a fragility there, a vulnerability she didn't hide entirely, but neither did she dramatize, it simply existed, quietly, humanly. I wanted to say something, to bridge the distance her words created, but I hesitated. Instead, I listened, feeling the weight of her story settle into the room like a slow-moving shadow. She spoke of late nights alone, of the awkwardness of learning to live in a space that had once been shared, and the subtle loneliness that came with realizing independence carried its own quiet ache. Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes glistened ever so slightly, the reflection of the lamplight tracing the depth of her experience. When she glanced at me, there was a fleeting pause, a small, deliberate connection. My hand moved almost instinctively closer, hovering near hers on the armrest, unsure whether to bridge the gap. She didn't pull away, and for a moment, her warmth seemed to seep into me, a reminder that trust often exists in silence as much as in words. The subtle rise and fall of her chest, the gentle weight of her presence beside me, made the space between us feel alive, electric, and intimate in ways that conversation alone could never achieve. The vulnerability in her tone, the way she allowed herself to be seen without pretense, created a bridge I hadn't realized I was waiting to cross. I could feel the beginnings of a bond forming, not rushed, not forced, but fragile and profound. There was a shared understanding in that quiet living room, a recognition that both of us carried unspoken stories and a quiet longing for connection. And in that suspended moment, I felt the magnetic pull of something deeper than curiosity, deeper than fleeting attraction. It was an acknowledgement of human fragility, of warmth and care, of the possibility of trust slowly turning into intimacy. Her presence was no longer just comforting, it was essential. And as the steam from our tea swirled between us, I realized that this evening, so unexpectedly begun, had become the start of a journey neither of us could yet name, but both of us were already feeling in the quiet of our shared space. By the time the evening deepened into night, the rain had all but ceased, leaving a soft mist that clung to the city streets below. The apartment was quiet except for the occasional hum of a distant car, the subtle ticking of a wall clock, and the faint rustle of her movements as she tidied the kitchen. The golden lamplight bathed the room in a warm glow, softening edges and creating small pockets of shadow where intimacy seemed to linger. She offered me the guest room, and I hesitated in the doorway. The thought of being alone in a new space, however temporary, felt strangely uncomfortable now. The hallway between the rooms was narrow, and as I passed her, our shoulders brushed. It was unintentional, fleeting, yet the warmth of her side against mine sent a small, unexpected shiver through me. I caught her glance, quiet and steady, and it held a mixture of understanding and something deeper, unspoken. The apartment was filled with ordinary nighttime sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft padding of her bare feet as she moved about, but they felt magnified in the stillness, creating a kind of suspended intimacy. Every small sound reminded me of her presence, her life quietly intersecting with mine. I noticed the faint scent of her shampoo lingering in the air, the gentle creak of the wooden floor beneath her steps. Each detail, ordinary on its own, combined to make proximity feel electric, charged with an unspoken anticipation. I settled into the guest room, but sleep felt distant. My thoughts kept drifting to the soft rhythm of her movements, the warmth that lingered in the hallway from her passing, the subtle tilt of her head as she glanced my way. I realized how acutely aware I was of her, not just physically, but emotionally. Every small interaction, every accidental touch, seemed to carry weight far beyond its surface. The tension was quiet, restrained, yet persistent, like a thread pulling us closer while the rules of propriety insisted we remain separate. At one point, I found myself pausing in the hallway as she returned from the kitchen. Our eyes met, and in that suspended moment, words felt unnecessary. The space between us was charged, a glance, a slight hesitation, the brush of fingers on a doorframe, all communicated more than any sentence could. The night was no longer merely an evening spent under the same roof, it had become an intricate dance of proximity and restraint, of desire held gently in check by respect and awareness. As I finally lay down, I realized that intimacy wasn't only in spoken words or deliberate gestures. Sometimes it existed in the quiet hesitation of shared space, in the small, accidental touches, and in the suspended heartbeat between glances. That night, even in separate rooms, we had crossed an invisible threshold, and the tension simmered just beneath the surface, promising that the bond we were forming was far from ordinary. The first rays of sunlight slipped softly through the sheer curtains, painting the apartment in a gentle, golden hue. The room smelled faintly of coffee and warm bread, a domestic symphony that made the early hour feel comforting rather than abrupt. I stirred from sleep, feeling the residual warmth of the blanket she had draped over me the night before. The apartment was quiet, alive only with subtle creaks and the distant city hum, yet it carried a sense of intimacy that made even ordinary movements feel significant. She emerged from the kitchen, her hair loosely tied, a soft apron draped over her shoulders. The simple act of her moving about, tending to breakfast, held a natural elegance that made my chest tighten in ways I couldn't yet define. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice gentle, casual, but carrying that same warmth that had first drawn me in the previous night. I nodded, and she handed me a steaming mug. The warmth seeped into my palms, but it was her proximity, the subtle sway of her body, the scent of vanilla and morning herbs, that stirred a quiet, unspoken tension. Breakfast was prepared with a care that felt personal, almost intimate. She passed me a plate of toast, her fingers brushing mine just enough to leave a fleeting warmth, a spark of connection. As she leaned to stir something on the stove, her shoulder lightly grazed mine, the contact accidental yet deliberate in its tenderness. I noticed the small things, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the softness in her voice when she spoke, the quiet attentiveness that seemed to encompass the room. Each detail grounded me, made the morning feel alive with shared presence. We ate slowly, savoring the food but even more so the unspoken closeness. There were no rushed words, only the small gestures that spoke volumes, the passing of a plate, the gentle brush of her hand as she set down the pan, the brief alignment of our hands on the table. Every moment felt intentional without needing intention, every glance carried a depth that words could never convey. By the time breakfast concluded, there was a quiet understanding between us. The night's hesitation had transformed into a morning of gentle connection. There was warmth in her presence that had nothing to do with food or light, it was the steady rhythm of her care, the subtle physical proximity, and the shared laughter that lingered longer than it should have. In that sunlit kitchen, the ordinary act of breakfast became an intimate dance of trust, affection, and unspoken desire. And when we finally stood there, lingering at the table, the space between us charged with small, meaningful touches, a hand resting briefly on a wrist, a smile held just a second too long, I realized that the slow burn of the night had blossomed into a morning of quiet, profound connection. The morning had grown brighter, the sun spilling through the windows and casting gentle patterns across the wooden floor. The rain was gone, leaving the world outside crisp and clear, but inside, the apartment felt suspended in its own quiet warmth. Breakfast dishes were cleared, the faint aroma of coffee and toasted bread still lingering in the air, mingling with the subtle scent of her perfume. We lingered near the kitchen counter, neither rushing to leave nor wanting the moment to end. The space between us was small but charged, our hands brushed lightly as she set a cup down, the warmth of her fingers lingering a moment longer than necessary. The subtle, everyday closeness of shared routine now carried a weight I hadn't expected. Each glance, each small touch, was a conversation without words, a gentle acknowledgement of the bond forming between us. She smiled softly at me, a quiet curve of her lips that spoke of understanding, comfort, and something deeper. I realized how natural it felt to be near her, how her presence had become a quiet anchor for my thoughts and emotions. There was no rush, no dramatic confession, just the steady, unspoken intimacy that had grown through the night and morning. The age gap, the uncertainties, the unspoken fears, they all felt secondary to the human connection that had blossomed in these small, shared moments. As I moved toward the door, our hands met briefly, a lingering touch on the wrist that neither of us drew away from too quickly. Her warmth seeped into me, and I felt a soft, steady pulse that mirrored my own heartbeat. It was the kind of touch that didn't need words, simple, respectful, and profoundly intimate. Our eyes held for a beat longer than necessary, and in that silence, there was acknowledgement, a recognition of mutual care, of respect, of attraction tempered by tenderness and trust. When I finally stepped out into the sunlight, the city felt sharper, more vibrant, yet I carried a piece of the apartment with me, the quiet comfort, the warmth of her presence, the subtle, lingering closeness of our hands and glances. I knew that our connection was just beginning, not rushed, not forced, but steady, grounded, and real. The evening and morning had unfolded naturally, each gesture building toward an intimacy that was as much emotional as it was physical, a slow-burning romance that neither of us needed to define in words. And as I walked down the hallway, the memory of her soft smile, the faint brush of her fingers, and the quiet, golden light of her apartment stayed with me. The story of that night had reached its resolution, not in grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but in the deep, human warmth of connection, trust, and the subtle thrill of a bond quietly, beautifully formed. If you enjoyed this slow burn moment, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the link in the description for the full story. You won't want to miss what happens next.